So there was a question before about domain and how we find domains. This is related to unit 2 of functions. And domain is kind of the set of all possible x values, all possible inputs, independent variables. And in our case, most of the time, when we have a function, it is this, whatever's in there. If it's x, if it's f of t, it's time, if it's like, even trig functions as well, like f of theta. Theta is my independent variable. So that the set that I have for x, t, and theta, those are my domains, my independent variable. In order to find my domain, all you have to care for are two major exceptions. There are two exceptions that we have learned in this class are when you have a square root of a negative. So two exceptions. One is square root of a negative. That does not work. And number two is dividing by 0. We just want to find out when and if this happens, and that kind of restricts our domain. So let's start with the more easy one of dividing by 0. When you divide by 0, and like in this case, unless you have like a clear restriction, as in like the question tells you, like, or like you are measuring some time, like kind of hours since, I don't know, eating, and you only care about like the first 10 hours. Then your domain is like from 0 when the experiment starts to 10 hours once the experiment ends. Or if you're given a graph, because we've done like some graph problems. Be like, oh, like what is the domain? Domain is from this point to that point. So there are other restrictions, but I think we are pretty fine with these graphing problems. But I don't want you to like look at this and like watch this video and be like, oh, like I thought about domain and this is the only thing that you need to care for. No, this is on top of the prior knowledge that you do have. Because I think looking at a graph was something we were familiar with before pre-calc. So I don't want you to lose this as you study for this exam. But the first thing, dividing by 0. When you divide by 0, and if it's not like this scenario, you kind of start with like, we have all real numbers. Because most of the time, like rational functions, we just want to find out if these exceptions happen. So you start with your set that you started off with. Whether it's all reals, whether it is this kind of chunk that you're given, you start with that. And you slowly take away. We want to take away from the domain. So if you have a function 1 over x squared minus 9, for example, we want to see when are we dividing by 0? When does this become 0? So we factor it out. We set the whole denominator equal to 0, and we solve for it. We solve for x. X minus 3, x plus 3 equals 0. So x equals 3 and negative 3. When x is 3 and when x is negative 3, my denominator is 0, and that breaks my function. So therefore, my domain for this function right here, for f of x equals this, is all real numbers, my domain, except x cannot be equal to negative 3 or positive 3. That is my domain. All reals, because any other x value does work here. 0 works, 9 works, 27 works, 342 works, 1.52 works. But once you plug in 3, you're dividing by 0 and it breaks it. That is exception number 2, dividing by 0. The second one is a bit more complex when you have a square root of a negative. So let's start with the most basic one, square root of x. If this is my function, I want to see when is my domain true? Like where does my domain exist? And this is kind of intuitive. You'd be like, oh, like when x is at least 0, that's my domain. Or you could write it like this, 0 to infinity. That's my domain. I just need to be at least 0. I could be 0 because square root of 0 is 0. I could be 1, I could be 5, I could be 27. But once I even get the slightest bit of negative, negative 0.0001, having any bit of negative there just breaks it. So this must be true. Now, moving on from this, you see when we have negative x plus 4, what we can do is take this understanding, be like, whatever's inside must be at least 0. So just like up here, when you set it equal to 0, we want to set the inside, not the denominator, but the inside, be like x plus 4 is at least 0, and solve for x. Minus 4, x is at least negative 4. That is my domain. Very quick video. These are the two rules I have domain, plus the graphing stuff. So if you have questions on the graph, feel free to email me. But I had a request to make a video on domain, so here's your video on domain.